February 18th, 1990, Dominion Theatre, London. The backstage corridors that normally echoed with champagne pops and laughter had fallen silent. Outside Queen's dressing room door, an invisible sentinel of silence stood guard. Inside, time itself seemed to have stopped. Freddie Mercury stood in front of a full-length mirror, trying to button a light blue suit that had been tailored just months ago, but now hung loose on his diminishing frame. Heavy foundation and brushes on the makeup table looked less like an artist's tools and more like a warrior's camouflage. His trembling fingers struggled with the jacket button. Once. Twice. His hands felt like they belonged to someone else. Then Brian May approached from the corner of the room, and what followed became one of the most profound conversations about dignity, choice, and what it means to refuse surrender even when your body is breaking. This is the story of the night Freddie Mercury chose to stand on stage one last time, not because he had to, but because a showman doesn't hide in the wings when his audience is waiting. February 1990 had settled over London like gray fog, heavy, oppressive, impossible to escape. The Dominion Theatre on Tottenham Court Road was one of London's grand old venues, the kind of place that had hosted everything from variety shows to rock concerts, where the ghosts of 1,000 performances lingered in the ornate architecture and faded velvet seats. Tonight, it was hosting the Brit Awards, Britain's premier music industry celebration, where the country's biggest stars gathered to celebrate another year of hits, sales, and cultural impact. It should have been a night of triumph for Queen. They were receiving the Brit Award for Outstanding Contribution to British Music, recognition of 2 decades of changing rock music forever. But backstage in their dressing room, triumph felt very far away. Freddie Mercury stood before a full-length mirror mounted on the concrete wall, staring at a reflection he barely recognized. He was 43 years old, but looked older, the kind of aging that doesn't come from years but from illness, from a body under siege. He'd lost nearly 40 pounds over the past months. His clothes, even those tailored just weeks ago, hung loose on a frame that seemed to be disappearing a little more each day. His face, once full and handsome, now showed sharp cheekbones and hollow spaces beneath his eyes. His skin had taken on a pallor that no amount of stage makeup could fully conceal. The light blue suit he wore had been chosen carefully. The color was meant to be cheerful, optimistic, a subtle defiance of the gray speculation that followed him everywhere. But the suit hung on him like it was still on the hanger, like his body was already becoming a ghost. His thick, dark mustache, the signature look that had defined 1980s, Freddie framed a mouth set in concentration as his trembling fingers tried to button the jacket. His short hair was impeccably styled, but the styling couldn't hide how thin it had become. He'd been fighting this battle in absolute secrecy for years. Years of lying to journalists who asked why he looked different. Years of canceling commitments with vague excuses. Years of watching his body betray the invincible image he'd spent 2 decades building. And now, standing in this dressing room with the roar of the crowd audible even through concrete walls, he was facing a choice. Go out there or give up. His fingers fumbled with the jacket button. Once it slipped through, twice his hands shook too badly to grip it. The simple act of getting dressed had become an ordeal. Brian May had been watching from the corner of the room. No guitar in his hands tonight, just the heavy weight of concern that a friend carries when they're watching someone they love struggle with something they can't fix. Brian's white curly hair was perfectly styled for the cameras, his own suit impeccable. At 37, he looked healthy, strong, vital. Everything Freddie had looked like just 2 years ago. The contrast was devastating. He approached slowly, giving Freddie space but unable to stay silent any longer. "Fred," Brian said, his voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile moment. "You don't have to do this. Nobody expects this from you. The people out there love you, they'll understand. We should leave. Get you home where you can rest." Freddie stopped. His hands froze on the jacket, button still unfastened. He looked at Brian in the mirror's reflection with an expression that was almost foreign, as if Brian had spoken a language Freddie didn't understand. In the corner of the room, Roger Taylor and John Deacon sat watching this confrontation between 2 titans, 2 friends who'd built an empire together and were now navigating its potential ending. Roger, 40 years old, his blonde hair showing the first hints of gray, sat with his drumsticks in his hands, not tapping, just holding them like a talisman. His usually energetic face was drawn with worry. John Deacon, 38, the quiet one who'd always been the band's emotional barometer, sat perfectly still. His dark, straight hair was neatly combed, his suit perfect, but his eyes showed the devastation of watching the foundation of everything they'd built slowly crumbling. Freddie slowly turned away from the mirror to face Brian directly. When he spoke, his voice was weak, diminished by the illness that was stealing his breath, along with everything else, but the steel will inside was still there, undiminished. "If I don't go out on that stage tonight, Brian," Freddie said carefully, each word an effort, "then what was the point of the last 20 years? What was the point of the stadiums, the performances, the work we did together? All of it becomes a story that ends with me hiding in a dressing room because I'm afraid." "This isn't about fear, Fred," Brian said, his own voice breaking slightly. "This is about being human, about accepting that you've given everything already and it's okay to rest." "Not giving up isn't refusing to be human," Freddie replied quietly. "It's refusing to let the disease write the ending to my story." Roger Taylor stood up from his chair, unable to stay silent any longer. His voice rose slightly with frustration born of love and helplessness. "You can barely stand, Fred. The stage lights are too hot. The crowd is too large. The walk is too far. We don't want them to see you like this. We want to protect you." Freddie turned to Roger, and what he said next was delivered with a hardness that surprised them all. Not cruelty, but absolute certainty. "How they see me doesn't matter, Roger. How I see myself matters. I am not a victim. I'm not a tragedy for people to pity. I'm Freddie Mercury, and a showman doesn't hide in the wings when his audience is waiting." A coughing fit interrupted his words, harsh, wet, painful. Brian stepped forward instinctively, wanting to help, to support, to do something. But Freddie raised one trembling hand to stop him. He gripped the edge of the makeup table, using it to steady himself until the coughing passed. When he could breathe again, he looked at his reflection in the mirror, at that pale, diminished face, and whispered to himself, "Come on, darling, just a bit more effort. You can do this." Then he turned back to face his three oldest friends, the men who'd shared everything with him for 2 decades. Success and failure, triumph and disaster, joy, and now this slow goodbye that none of them wanted to acknowledge. "Look," Freddie said, his voice gaining strength from conviction, if not from health. "Those cheers out there, that applause waiting for us, that's my medicine. That's what keeps me going. If I don't go out there and say thank you, if I don't finish this story properly, then I leave it incomplete. I leave them wondering, I leave myself wondering if I had just a bit more courage at the end." He paused, gathering breath. "You're going to get me on that stage tonight. Either I walk out there on my own 2 feet or you carry me out, but I'm going out there. The choice isn't whether I go, it's whether you'll be standing beside me when I do." The silence that followed was absolute. Brian May looked into Freddie's eyes and saw something that ended all argument. Absolute determination. This wasn't a medical decision anymore. This wasn't about what was healthy or safe or reasonable. This was about honor, about dignity, about a man's right to choose how his story ends. Brian felt tears forming in his eyes. He stepped forward and bent down slightly, not patronizing, but gentle, and carefully fastened the jacket button that Freddie's trembling fingers couldn't manage. It was an act of love rendered a service, of accepting what Freddie needed, even if it wasn't what Brian wanted for him. "Okay," Brian said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "Okay, Freddie. We're with you, just like always." Roger Taylor wiped his eyes quickly, not bothering to hide the tears. "Always, Fred, all the way to the end of the line." John Deacon said nothing. He rarely did in moments like this, but he stood up and walked over to Freddie, placing one hand briefly on his friend's shoulder. The gesture said everything words couldn't. "I'm here. I'm not leaving. You're not alone." The announcement came through the dressing room speaker, tinny and distant, but clear. "And the winner of the Outstanding Contribution to British Music Award is Queen." The roar from the audience was audible even through concrete and steel, thousands of people applauding, celebrating, expecting to see the 4 members of Queen emerge triumphant. Freddie took a deep breath. It was a physical effort. His lungs didn't work the way they used to. Everything was harder now, but he pulled air into his body like he was pulling on armor. And something remarkable happened. As he prepared to leave the dressing room, Freddie seemed to lift all the pain, all the exhaustion, all the visible signs of illness, and hang them on an invisible hook by the door. His shoulders straightened. His posture shifted from the hunched defensive position of someone in pain to the confident bearing of a performer who owned every stage he walked onto. His face still gaunt, still showing the ravages of the disease transformed. Not physically, but in expression. The famous arrogant smile appeared, the one that had commanded Wembley Stadium and conquered the world. His eyes, which had been dull with exhaustion moments before, suddenly showed a spark of the old Freddie the showman, the legend, the man who never met a stage he couldn't dominate. When he walked through that dressing room door, he walked as Freddie Mercury, not as a sick man pretending to be well. And his three bandmates fell into step behind him, a protective phalanx, ready to catch him if he fell, but believing he wouldn't. The walk from dressing room to stage couldn't have been more than 50 feet. Freddie had commanded stadiums, had strutted across stages the size of football fields, had owned every venue he'd ever performed in. But this 50-foot walk felt longer than all those stadium stages combined. Each step required concentration, effort, will. The corridor seemed to stretch endlessly. The roar of the crowd grew louder, more demanding. The lights at the stage entrance got brighter, hotter, more intense. Roger walked beside him, close enough to catch him if his knees buckled. John flanked his other side, creating a protective wall. Brian led the way, turning back every few steps to check that Freddie was still upright, still moving, still determined. And then they were at the stage entrance. The lights were blinding. The crowd noise was deafening. The heat from the stage lights hit like a physical force. Freddie paused for just a moment, one final breath, one final gathering of strength. Then he stepped into the spotlight. The audience erupted, thousands of people on their feet, applauding, celebrating, completely unaware that they were witnessing Freddie Mercury's final public appearance. Unaware that the man walking slowly but steadily toward the podium was using every ounce of remaining strength just to stay upright. The cameras focused on his face, broadcasting his image to millions of homes across Britain. People watching at home would later say they noticed something different about him, something quieter, something that suggested the unstoppable force they'd known was finally meeting an obstacle he couldn't overcome. But what they saw was dignity. What they saw was Freddie Mercury refusing to let illness define him. What they saw was a masterclass in courage that had nothing to do with stage presence and everything to do with simple human will. Brian stepped to the microphone first, as planned. His speech was gracious, thanking the fans, acknowledging the award, expressing gratitude for a career that had exceeded their wildest dreams. His voice was steady, but anyone who knew him could hear the emotion underneath the weight of knowing this was goodbye. Roger and John stood beside Freddie, close enough to support him if needed. All three of them watched their friend, seeing what the cameras didn't. The tremendous effort required to simply stand still under those hot lights, the careful breathing, the locked knees keeping him upright. Brian's speech wound toward its conclusion. The moment was almost over. Freddie could retreat backstage, collapse into a chair, let the exhaustion finally win. But then Brian turned to him and gestured toward the microphone, not demanding, not expecting, just offering, giving Freddie one last chance to speak to the world on his own terms, if he had the strength. For 3 seconds that felt like 3 years, Freddie stood frozen. Every instinct told him to decline, to let Brian finish, to preserve his energy for the ordeal of getting back to the dressing room, back to the car, back to Garden Lodge and the bed where he spent most of his days now. But then he thought about all those people watching not just in the theater, but at home, around Britain, around the world eventually when this footage was replayed. He thought about all the outsiders who'd found themselves in Queen's music. All the different ones, the strange ones, the ones who didn't fit anywhere else. He thought about what it would mean if Freddie Mercury, who'd spent his entire career refusing to be invisible, refusing to tone himself down, refusing to apologize for being exactly who he was, went silent at the end. Freddie Mercury stepped forward to the microphone. The audience's applause swelled, anticipating one of his famous quips, one of those perfectly timed remarks that had made him legendary off stage as well as on. But when Freddie opened his mouth, only three words emerged. Three words delivered in a voice that was quieter than the world had ever heard from him. Three words that carried the weight of everything he couldn't say. Thank you. Good night. That was all. No jokes, no theatrical flourishes, no Freddie Mercury bravado, just gratitude. And goodbye. The audience applauded again, thinking it was just part of the moment. Just Freddie being gracious, not realizing they were witnessing a farewell, not knowing that the man they just celebrated was using every ounce of remaining strength to walk off that stage with dignity intact. As soon as the cameras cut away, as soon as the bright lights shifted to the next presenter, Freddie's carefully maintained composure cracked. His knees buckled. The strength that had carried him through the performance evaporated like steam. Roger and Brian caught him before he fell, their strong hands holding him upright, supporting the weight he could no longer support himself. "You did it, Fred," Brian whispered as they guided him off stage. "You were magnificent." Freddie couldn't respond. He was too exhausted even for words. But he'd done what he came to do. He'd stood in front of the cameras and the crowd one last time. He'd refused to let the disease have the final word about who he was. Back in the dressing room, they helped him into a chair. Jim Hutton, his partner, who'd been waiting with quiet, supportive presence, brought water. Mary Austin appeared with a blanket because Freddie was suddenly shivering despite the warmth. The others gave him space, stepping back to let him recover, to let the performance end and the reality return. Freddie sat there wrapped in a blanket, trembling from exhaustion in the aftermath of adrenaline. His face had gone pale again, the color that the stage lights and determination had brought draining away. But there was peace in his expression, the peace that comes from knowing you faced the thing you were afraid of, and you didn't break. "Did I do well?" he asked Mary quietly, needing confirmation, needing to know the performance had worked. Mary knelt beside his chair, taking his hand. Her eyes were filled with tears, but her voice was steady. "You were the only king in that room, Freddie. You always are." That night, leaving the Dominion Theater, Freddie Mercury had taught everyone watching a profound lesson. The final curtain of life comes however it comes. But staying on stage until it falls is not about obligation. It's about character. 20 months later, on November 24th, 1991, Freddie Mercury would die at Garden Lodge, surrounded by the people who loved him. But that night at the Brit Awards would be remembered as his final public appearance. Three words that contained a lifetime of defiance and dignity. Thank you. Good night. For those of us who remember, who are now in our 60s and 70s ourselves, who have watched friends fade and felt mortality's approach, Freddie's choice that night resonates deeply. True victory isn't about never falling. It's about refusing to surrender until the very end. Freddie didn't surrender that night, he stood, and that silent farewell was actually the loudest song he ever sang. The industry would continue. New stars would rise. The Brit Awards would go on year after year. But that moment when a dying man gathered every remaining ounce of strength to say thank you and goodbye with dignity, intact, that moment became eternal. Because Freddie Mercury showed us all that we get to choose how our story ends. Not whether it ends that's beyond our control, but how we face that ending, whether we do it with dignity or defeat, with grace or bitterness. That choice remains ours until the very last breath. He chose grace. He chose dignity. He chose to be Freddie Mercury until the lights went down for the final time. Thank you, Freddie. Good night.